Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning. My name is Bonny Lin, and I'm the director of the China Power Project at CSIS. I'm co-hosting this event with my colleague Jude Blanchette, Freeman Chair in China Studies. Today, we will be discussing a recent unique survey by the Carter Center conducted on Chinese public opinion on the conflict in Ukraine. The survey was just released, and folks who want to read the survey results can visit the U.S.-China Perception Monitor website. Today, we have three fascinating speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Yawei Liu. Dr. Liu is the senior advisor on China at the Carter Center. Dr. Liu has written extensively on China's political development and grassroots diplomacy. More recently, he's been focused on U.S.-China relations and China's role in the developing world. Our second speaker is Michael Cerny, who is the associate editor of the Carter Center's U.S.-China Perception Monitor. He is an MPhil candidate in the Department of Politics, International Relations at the University of Oxford. And finally, we'll turn to my colleague Jude Blanchette as the third speaker. So without much ado, let me first turn to Yawei to discuss how the survey was conducted. So Yawei, over to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Bonnie, for the generous introduction. So how did we think about the survey? So it actually started last September. We conducted a pilot survey on how Chinese perceive the United States and how they perceive China's international image. We're working with an online data survey company called Yawei, which is based in Toronto. And that pilot survey attracted some attention. So we decided that we're going to conduct a regularized survey in the coming months. So the first wave probably will be in the early summer, and the second wave later in the year or early next year. Why we do this? Because it's so difficult now to conduct a survey in China to assess public opinion in China. We know there are institutions and think tanks that have done this kind of survey in China, but recently they have all decided not to do it anymore because it's hard to find a partner in China. It's also very difficult to get the questionnaire approved. But to do it online in a very scientific way that Michael probably will explain a little bit, how this survey is conducted. The second reason is, people always ask, is there public opinion in China? Recently I had a meeting with Chinese diplomats in Atlanta, and he told us, he said, the public opinion is such that making foreign policy is very difficult for us. The question is then, what is public opinion in China? So while we're discussing the regularized survey with Yawei, it's when the war broke out in Ukraine. So we came up with the idea, maybe, you could do so. So this is right after we published Professor Huwei's article. We wonder, how popular is Huwei's idea, the war in Ukraine, global order, and China's choice. We talked to some of the international relations experts in China. We were told that probably anywhere between 60 to 70% of the scholars think Huwei is right. They agree with him. But does that sort of more elite kind of opinion is reflected in the publics in China? So that's when we went to Yawei and said, let's do this. And so as a result, we actually were able to complete this within a week. And we were asking for a sample of 3,600, but they were able to collect about 4,600 people that have responded to this. So the finding initially, I was tweeting about this, I was hoping that there are more people who are opposed to the government position. But of course, I was proven wrong. I was also thinking the conspiracy theory that Americans and the Ukrainians are working in the biolabs, and probably COVID-19 virus came out of one of the labs over there. I thought that is just like so off the wall that very few in China should believe in it. And I was proven wrong again. So on that note, I'll turn it over to Michael to share quickly the general findings. Of course, the bigger challenge is, so what, right? How do we explain the findings? And to extend it, the question is, what is real public opinion in China? How real is this? And how, if this is real, how that kind of public opinion, is it manufactured or is it spontaneous? And so there are many associated questions that all of us need to look into, and that probably will inform us in terms of interpreting more accurately the policy and the context through which these policies are made and evaluated. So Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. So just before I dive into the data, I just want to say thank you to CSIS for the opportunity to share these survey results. And I also want to quickly thank Dr. Haifeng Huang, who's an associate professor of political science at University of California, Merced, for his thoughtful advice and suggestions as we collected and analyzed this data. So with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this is, to our knowledge, the first representative survey of online Chinese public opinion. So between March 28th and April 5th this year, the Carter Center, as Dr. Liu explained, engaged with Yawei Corporation, a Canadian survey company, to conduct a survey of China's online population with respect to the invasion. Now, Yawei technology allows for the rapid capture of large samples of public opinion data by delivering anonymous opt-in surveys to web users surfing online in whatever population is the population of interest. And it's done so through a technology called random domain intercept technology, which in essence allows Yawei to plant surveys or essentially install surveys onto broken links or missing web pages on the Chinese internet. And instead of receiving an error when a user lands on that page, they instead receive a short survey. So in other words, respondents for this survey were not incentivized to participate, nor was any personally identifying information collected. And the data that were collected was collected using systems and servers placed outside of China to help safeguard the anonymity of respondents. In total, the survey received 4,886 complete responses. The sample skews male and young, which is common amongst most online surveys. So during the analysis phase, we weighted the data using US Census Bureau projections for age and gender in China to make sure we were getting a representative sample of China's internet using population. With respect to the questions, this was rather a short survey. 3 primary questions were administered in the Chinese language, along with additional questions assessing the demographic characteristics of the respondent, including their age, gender, education, income, and media diet. With respect to the 3 main questions, question A asked respondents whether they feel that supporting Russia in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict is in China's national interest. Question B asked respondents what they consider China's best course of action with respect to the invasion. And question C asked respondents about their outlook on the conspiracy theory that Russia's so-called special military operation has uncovered American biolabs in Ukraine. The demographic questions are fairly intuitive, so I won't go into too much detail, but I'll provide a little bit more information about the media diet question. Perhaps what yields the most interesting findings with respect to the 3 main questions is where Chinese or respondents and Chinese citizens are actually getting their news about from international relations. So we asked respondents to report this, and they were given the options of whether they got it mostly from national state media, local state media, business media, foreign media, or social media, or lastly, just from interpersonal communication. So to give a brief description of our findings, or actually even before I do that, I just want to say, before I dive into what I hope isn't too many numbers, if you want to look at data visualizations along with what I'm describing, they are now available on our website. So please do take a look if I'm bombarding you with too many numbers. So first, our analysis suggests that about 75% of China's internet using population believes that supporting Russia and Ukraine is in China's national interests. About 40% of whom somewhat agree with this perspective, and 35% of whom strongly agree with this perspective. We also find that higher levels of education are associated with greater support for Russia, and that greater exposure to national, state media, and social media are also associated with higher levels of support. Overall, these results are somewhat unsurprising. There was a recent thread of tweets by Jennifer Pan and her co-researchers in Stanford's Department of Political Science discussing Chinese public opinion with respect to social media posts on Weibo. And after collecting about 500,000 of these posts, they found that approximately half attributed the conflict to the US, NATO, and Ukraine, compared to only 10% which attributed the conflict to Russia. These are, of course, are not representative of what the Chinese population as a whole or internet using population as a whole might think because of the existence of censorship. But when given an explicit choice, our results show that about 75% think it is in China's national interest to support Russia. So moving to the second question, question B asked respondents what they consider China's best course of action with respect to the invasion. And to get a better sense of respondent preferences, we actually split the sample and offered slightly different answer choices. So for one split of the data, we asked respondents what they consider China's best course of action with the following options. Either 1, provide moral support to Russia, 2, provide weapons to Russia, 3, condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or 4, provide weapons to Ukraine. With the first of these options, provide moral support to Russia, reflecting what we think most closely aligns with China's current strategy. We find that amongst this split, about 60% of respondents believe that China should offer moral support to Russia, and notably, only about 15% feel that China should support Russia with military assistance, such as weapons. A similar number of respondents actually support condemning the Russian invasion, which suggests that neither of these views are mainstream in China. Lastly, we find that about 10% of respondents think China should provide military assistance to Ukraine, like NATO countries. So we also administered that same question to a second split of the sample, but with the option mediate an end to the conflict included. And what's interesting is that when provided, about 60% of respondents, 58% of respondents believe China should mediate an end to the conflict. And the number who believe China should offer even moral support to Russia is only about 20%. This suggests an interesting conclusion. So when paired with the first question, those who strongly agree that supporting Russia is in China's national interest are quite a bit more likely to believe offering moral support to Russia is in China's best interest. By contrast, those that only somewhat agree with the perspective that support Russia or supporting Russia is in China's national interest, which represent the plurality of the sample, so about 40% of respondents, they are actually somewhat more likely to support mediating an end to the conflict over providing moral support. And this generates interesting questions about, while a majority may think that the current approach by the Chinese government is best, how strongly they hold that belief is a separate question that is interesting to analyze, and I hope we can discuss at some point during this webinar. So lastly on this question, we also find that higher levels of education and greater exposure to national state media and social media are associated with higher levels of support for actions more helpful to Russia. Third, question C asked respondents about their outlook on the conspiracy theory that Russia's special military operation has uncovered American biolabs in Ukraine. For this question, we gave respondents the option to indicate whether they had seen the conspiracy theory before and whether they believe it to be accurate, inaccurate, or they don't know. And then we subsetted the data or split the data up according to whether respondents had encountered the theory and then their perspective on its veracity. So interestingly, about 50% of the sample has encountered the conspiracy theory before, which really shows the power of the sort of pro-Russian media environment in China at present. And among those who had seen it before, about 70% of respondents believe it to be accurate, compared to about 30% who believe it to be inaccurate. Very interestingly and somewhat counterintuitively, higher levels of education as opposed to lower levels of education are associated with a higher level of belief in the conspiracy theory. Along with greater exposure to national state media and social media. Consistent with other findings in the political science literature, women and to some extent people with higher income are less likely to believe this conspiracy theory while older people are more likely to believe it. Among those who had not seen this conspiracy theory before, about 50% indicated they believed it to be accurate, compared to only about 13% who believed it to be inaccurate, and about 36% who said they didn't know. So to sort of wrap up, how can we put these results together and what do they suggest about Chinese public opinion? Or in other words, what are the key takeaways? So first, the main takeaway is that the majority of China's internet using population do feel that supporting Russia is in China's best interest. Our results suggest that this percentage who agree with this perspective is around 75%. And by breaking down the correlates of this attitude, support for Russia tends to be strongest amongst those who are better educated and get their news about international relations from state and social media. Second, although the survey does not examine the motivating reasons behind this belief, expert analyses have previously suggested, such as by a recent article by Maria Repnikova and Wendy Zhou at Georgia State University, suggests that most Chinese see this conflict through an anti-Western and anti-American prism, and our results suggest that this is likely the case. So, for example, this is supported by the majority of respondents who believe that Russia has uncovered American biolabs in Ukraine, a conspiracy theory that likely resonates with other conspiracy theories, such as regarding the origin of COVID-19 in the United States. Kind of rather shockingly, among those who have encountered the conspiracy theory, 72% believe it's accurate, and among those who have not, only 13% believe it to be inaccurate, which indicates that this is a rather widely held belief. Third, and despite these pro-Russian positions, the results of the survey suggest that a majority of around 60% of Chinese internet users in the sample believe the government should mediate an end to the conflict. And in the absence of mediation, approximately 60% of respondents think that it's in China's best interest to offer moral support to Russia. Only a small minority believe that providing weapons to Russia or other forms of military assistance are or is in China's best interest. So ultimately, I think one conclusion I take away from this is that the findings suggest that they suggest the influence of the generally pro-Russian information environment in China today. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it back.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Yawei, for both discussing the survey results as well as your methodology. I think one thing that really interested me in the survey was the 10% that wanted to provide weapons to Ukraine, but I'm sure we will discuss this during the Q&A. But before we do that, let me turn to my colleague Jude Blanchette for his thoughts on the survey, as well as discussing some of the larger implications of the survey for understanding either US-China relations or China-Russia relations. So Jude, over to you.
Well, thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, Yawei, Michael. First, I want to just congratulate you on putting out just a really fantastic product, one that helps give us additional nuance to try to understand this very complicated issue of how China is responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think most of us have really been focused on Beijing's public diplomatic messaging. And so now we have some additional data points to understand some of the complexities of how the Chinese population is responding to this. I should also say this is just another product in a series that you've been putting out, which have really been shaping the discussion on how us outside analysts look at China's position. I'm sure everyone watching this knows of the Perception Monitor's publication last month of the really blockbuster article by Yawei, which I think was really for 2 to 3 weeks was all that I was being sent into my inbox, but was just another indication of how important the Carter Center's work is on this. I just have a few initial thoughts after spending a week or so looking at the results and then hearing the presentations today. And of course, even with the caveats that both Yawei and Michael have made about this is not this does not capture all the opinions or all the complexities in public perception or public opinion on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Nonetheless, it really does capture some really important insights. The first I had is, and I'd love to hear Michael and Yawei if comments on this after we go to the broader discussion and Q&A. While it does appear that top line number of 75% supporting Russia was quite striking, I was also equally as struck by the course of action that was recommended or by most respondents was trying to end the conflict. So it felt like the support was contingent and was not a sort of full-throated support of Russia's position to achieve victory, but was largely rhetorical or what you call moral support with the view that China could help mediate an end to the crisis. To Bonnie's point just now, I was also struck that nearly as many respondents were calling for China to arm Ukraine as were calling for China to arm Russia, which again, I think adds an interesting caveat to that top line number of overwhelming support from Russia. Again, it's very both in terms of those calling for arming either Ukraine or Russia. It's a minority of respondents, but it shows to me that this top line support is not translating into a very aggressive nationalist call for China to really throw its lot in with Russia and start to get its hands dirty. In fact, it's saying what your conclusion finds. We're viewing this largely through the prism of US-China relations, or at least anti-West. So we want to continue with our support for Russia, but there are boundaries on this, and this is contingent, and we would like to see an end to the conflict. So in some ways, the top line number, I get a little less worried when you start looking at some of the other numbers that you found, which I think complicate the top line result. Second, and this is where I think the biolabs question is really interesting, it is very disturbing to me just how low levels of trust there are in the United States. We can blame that on Chinese state media, we can blame that on social media, but I think there is an extent to which the United States itself needs to recognize that our image in the eyes of many ordinary Chinese has deteriorated over the last decade or so. Some of this, I think, is out of our control. Some of this is clearly in our control. And I think this is maybe a point for another different discussion on US-China relations. But it doesn't surprise me, given how the United States has talked broadly about China over the last 5 to 10 years, and in largely negative ways, that has affected how many Chinese view the United States. And from my own very anecdotal data set of friends and former colleagues in China, it strikes me that many have become very disillusioned with the United States, especially when you look at this in a holistic manner and start viewing U.S. policies on restricting or perceiving to restrict the ability of Chinese students to come here to the United States, the way in which the United States talks about China's political system, in which many feel is unfair. I'm not making a normative comment here, but just an analytical one, that it shouldn't be surprising to us that this is having real profound knock-on effects for our overall perception in the eyes of many Chinese. So we can either look at this issue of the biolabs leak and blame this exclusively on social media. But I think this, to me, I interpret this as a call to arms to begin thinking with a bit more clarity and nuance about how we message to China, even if many of us broadly support a more aggressive set of policies to compete with China. Final 2 points. I was really struck by what Michael was just talking about, an apparent split between sort of more grassroots views on Russia and what I see to be the more elite views on Russia. I think Bonnie would find the same thing in our sort of informal and some of our track 2 discussions. It seems fairly uniform to me that there is a great deal of skepticism and concern amongst Chinese foreign policy scholars about Beijing's current position vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. And in many ways, the Yawei essay that you published, I think one of the reasons it resonated so much is it spoke for many very informed China foreign policy watchers who saw many of the same dynamics and potential pitfalls for Beijing in the analysis that Yawei outlined. But there seems to be a divergence here potentially a divergence between mass opinion, which might be more broadly sympathetic to a quote unquote pro-Russia opinion, caveats noted, and I think the foreign policy elite. And this may, I think, disabuse us of the idea that there's going to be some sort of course correction here from Beijing. It seems to me that Xi Jinping is very aware that if he can rhetorically at least claim to have the masses or the broad public on his side, that allows him to navigate forward, I think, without quite as much concern for how some of the elite may be viewing or have disagreements with some of his positions. It's also interesting, though, to build on one of Michael's points, that most foreign policy elite in China construct their view on the Ukraine-Russia issue largely outside of a state media-centric ecosystem. So this may as much be supporting the point that one of your findings of state media works in many ways. And if you're primarily getting your information from state media and or with a dollop of social media, that you're unfortunately going to have views which more align with Beijing's preference than if you're independently constructing your worldview from a more heterodox, goulash of media sources. And then I think the final point is, and I don't want to over egg the similarities, but in terms of thinking about the state media effect on public perception in China and maybe some of the nuance we want to have in interpreting this or over-interpreting this, there has been in the United States over the past few years a series of polling data coming out of some of the big polling organizations like Pew, but also some of the sort of regional and local foreign affairs councils, which show a pronounced decline in US perception of views on China. Now, you can read that as a leading indicator, and therefore politics will follow that. Or, and I think this is arguably more likely, that's simply a reflection of the fact that US politicians have taken a much more aggressive line on China, and therefore that reflects out into public perceptions. Essentially, public views in China are as much shaped by the political ecosystem as the inverse, right? That the political ecosystem is shaped by public perception. So I notice here in the United States, and again, I mean this as an analytical comment, not as a normative one, but many sort of hawkish politicians here in the United States can point to some of these polling data to say, see, the public is with us. I think a more complex view and a nuanced view would say that actually we've helped shape these public perceptions of China, which we're now using as leverage for our own existing points of view. I wonder if something similar could be going on here. And certainly for those of us, myself included, who have argued that Beijing is unlikely to shake its position on Russia, I could point to this and say, and I probably have over the past week, and I probably will in the weeks to come, say, see, this shows that China is likely to follow a very pro-Russia position. But if I'm being honest, what this shows is that actually Beijing has been successful in shaping public perceptions, and Michael, I think, and Yawei, you alluded to this. If there was a much more open, pluralistic media environment in China, one where state media was competing with, 1,000 different Caixins of the world, we might actually see these numbers shape in not insignificant ways. So I guess my final comment is I'm going to take these as a partial snapshot of a highly evolving, sort of fast-moving current event, and one that is constrained by an existing stock of media outlets, many of them state-led, rather than a very fulsome final say on where the Chinese public comes down on the issue. None of that is to degrade or belittle the contribution of this. It's just to say I'm aware of how I might be tempted to use this to support my own pre-existing political agenda. So I'm just sort of flagging that here because I think that's one of the dynamics I can imagine, occurring. So anyway, that being said, this is just incredibly helpful, super important. And I hope we can spend the next 20 or so minutes digging into it. I'm going to kind of moderate this next section, but maybe what I might do is just pause for a minute to see if Yawei or Michael, you had any, thoughts or comments, either responding to each other or responding to what I just said before I start throwing some of the questions we've got coming in at you.
I would like to quickly respond to what Jude mentioned is, if China's media environment is more liberal or relaxed, then this real public opinion probably will shift significantly, either on the subject of the war in Ukraine or, for example, the issue of Taiwan. People always say, if there's going to be a referendum in China, whether the Chinese government is going to use force or not, probably 90% of the people will vote for the use of the force if Taiwan people refuse to become part of the motherland. My reaction to that is always, if you allow people to discuss this issue more openly, not just the unification, but what's the benefit of leaving Taiwan alone, that you don't censor this kind of argument or articles or essays. So if you survey the social media, those who say, we are going to use force, they are never censored. And if you say it takes 8 hours for the PLA to seize control of Taiwan, that article is never going to be censored. But if you come out and say, if you use force, how are you going to pacify the island? It's going to be a bigger challenge. And what does that unification mean for the country? Then these articles are going to be censored. So that's the same case when the war in Ukraine started, is that the pro-Russian view, they're everywhere. But those that are pro-Ukraine or pro the Western position response to this, they're censored. I think now we see opening that some of the pro-Ukraine view is allowed to navigate. So that's one thing. Is again, I just want to emphasize, Jude, your comment is very very good on that. The second is I think this survey also reflects, even though there is the division of the elite view and also the grassroots view, but I think there is a growing likelihood that the elite in China, so what I mean by elite is, the leadership as well as scholars like Yawei and others, they're growing resentment of the US because of what the US government officials have said about China, because of the sanctions, because of the measures. And what I usually say is this is kind of like the pivot to Russia. It happened in 1919 when President Wilson was not able to stop Japan from taking over the Jiaodong Peninsula. So the May 4th movement, Mao Zedong, Li Dazhao, Chen Duxiu, all these people, they're very deep disappointment and frustration and disillusionment with the Western liberal democracy. And of course, Moscow's declaration that all seized territory from China is going to be returned. So that enabled the elite to pivot to Russia. And of course, it led to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And now this second pivot to Russia has to be examined in the bigger context, is what does US want to do with China, regardless of whether China is going to change or not. So I think the best asset for US, for many of these years is China's favorable perception of the United States, by the elite and also by the ordinary citizen. And this landscape is changing. It doesn't bode well for the future of the relationship. So I'll stop here.
Thanks, Yawei. We've got I've got about 10 questions that have just come in over the past few minutes. So let me try to group some of these. One of them is, and this actually is in one of the notes that I wrote here, and I apologize, I forget if it was Michael or Yawei who made this comment, but on, I think it's you, Yawei, saying sort of Beijing often says, or the embassy in Atlanta said, some of the officials said that they're, kind of constrained in some of their foreign policy because of the public opinion that they're getting here. That, of course, is a fairly old trope coming from Beijing. And actually, folks who've read Jessica Chen Weiss's, really fantastic book, Powerful Patriots, will see a really close unpacking of times in which Beijing likes to say it's constrained by public opinion. So it'll allow some of the mass protests to go against Japan, because then that allows it to say, hey, we'd love to be more accommodative, but we can't. We've got these, mass protests on our hand. I've been hearing that a lot recently. Vague calls to online opinion that are pro-Russia as constraining China's position here. I wondered if you could, unpack that a little bit in terms of the causality, or which way the causation goes. Do you see any? Looking at these these findings, but also I think just zooming out a little bit, Michael and Yawei, do you see this as being the result of state media shaping public views, and therefore if Beijing wanted to become more flexible and adapt its position, let's say more away from a much more overt pro-Russia China position to something that's a little bit more flexible or hedged, do you think they're constrained by public opinion that appears to show that there's a pro-Russia bent? Or do you think Beijing would be able to, through its control of state media, shape that such that they did not pay much of an audience cost for adopting a more conciliatory or pro-Western approach? But open it up to either Yawei or Michael.
Michael, why don't you go ahead first?
Sure. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just address the sort of first half of that question, and then Dr. Liu, why don't you maybe address the second and speak a little bit more to maybe the contemporary constraints. But I think, Jude, I think you've brought up a really, really good point that sort of throughout your comments, and then this question captures that as well, which is that sort of public opinion and foreign policy or government behavior, they're endogenous. So in other words, the arrow of causality is always pointing in both directions. And, a lot of like academic political science work, for example, has tried to tease out, which direction, when the arrow points in one or the other direction, when does it tend to be strongest? And, there have been articles, there was one in the Journal of Politics just a few weeks ago that looked at this in the context of the UK, and they found that, when you selectively expose UK legislatures or members of parliament to public opinion data, they're more likely to adjust their own positions to what public opinion has to say. But in reality, at the same time, that public opinion is also driven by what the government is doing at the same time. So really being able to unpack that is extremely difficult. I think in terms of the constraints, and this is something that I think Yawei would be better than me to speak to just at the current moment. I think the useful prism to look at the way that the arrows point is through this kind of general anti-American sentiment that's built up since the 1990s. So, and the reason I say that is a lot of the work that was done on public opinion research really around the time of the Soviet Union, and particularly during the earlier decades of the Soviet Union, looked at public opinion through what was called the hypodermic needle model. It was sort of, the notion was embraced that state media would determine what its position was on a particular issue, and then it would sort of inject this into everybody's minds through essentially control over state media. And obviously that does not reflect how information actually disseminates into the real world. And in China, it's a much more even, today, where you have a much more or a very controlled media environment. People still look to opinion leaders that are sort of maybe affiliated with state media or, one step below state media, where, they trust the information that they receive from them. But at the same time, so once it's sort of filtered down to that level, that is also what, yes, the government will point to and say, look, this is what the public already believes. And I think it's difficult to look at any specific issue, the causal arrow from any specific issue. It's probably impossible to identify. But if you look at it through sort of the general rising anti-American sentiment since the 1990s, it makes sense. And to exemplify this, the previous wave of the survey that we did way back in September, where we just looked at individuals' views of the United States, whether they had a positive or negative conception of the United States, or favorable or unfavorable, you could really see a bifurcation amongst the generation that was reading the news in the 1980s. So people, people who were essentially out of the school system in the 1980s tend to have, when they're older, or people of that come from that generation, they tend to have more positive perceptions of the United States. But then people that were born in the 1990s and, for example, attended school after the implementation of patriotic education in 1993, 1994, they tend to have a more negative view of the United States. And really, if you filter most of these issues through that prism, that maybe it's because state media generally portrays, an anti-American stance, regardless of the particular issue at hand, that's sort of the key filter and key prism by which a lot of this is unfolding. And that's why it sort of reflects a cycle as time goes on. And it's a cycle that will be difficult to break. So maybe in some sense it does constrain leaders at the moment, because this is sort of this is a sentiment that is built up over decades and is now sort of a reservoir of anti-American, anti-Western sentiment. So that does perhaps, or at least in my perspective, implement some constraint.
So my quick response is, number one, that public opinion that Chinese decision makers often cite that because the opinion is such, so our hands are tied, is that we already discussed, that opinion can change if you allow a more liberal, more open media environment. Secondly, China governing model is such that the leadership can make decisions despite the public opinion. If they're going to follow the public opinion, I don't think the lockdown in Shanghai is going to happen, right? And thirdly, I think that's, it's linked to what I said earlier, is what does China get out of this? If China, for example, is going to condemn the Russian invasion, is going to work with the US and European countries, to end the war. Ambassador Qinggang just published an article in National Interest today, basically still saying US and China, we can work together, for peace and prosperity. But then, you probably have noticed, the very widely popular tweet by China's anchorwoman Liu Xin, who said, you want us to destroy a friend so that you're going to be in a better position to destroy us. It's similar to the South China Morning Post op-ed by retired senior Colonel Zhou Bo, making the same argument. What is the real U.S. intention on China? Yes, we understand you want us to work with you. And as far as Ambassador Qinggang's article is concerned, Beijing probably is serious in terms of, let's coordinate, let's work together to end the war in Russia. But what exactly is the calculus of the U.S.? And that's, I guess, is what Jude mentioned, this low trust between the two sides. Without resolving that, it's very hard.
Well, of course, Yawei, the United States has completely benign intentions, as you know, right?
Right, exactly.
Bonny Lin wanted to ask a question, so I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Jude. I actually had a question on methodology. So, Michael, as you were discussing how the survey was conducted in the sense of these broken search links and then the survey popping up, I guess the concern that arose in my head was, as, for example, Chinese participants are seeing the survey pop up on their internet, would they feel that their results aren't being monitored by the Chinese government? Because I worry that maybe the reason the results very much align with what the Chinese government position is, that the survey respondents are thinking that their results are being monitored. So maybe a good portion of them might be filling in the results based on what they think are the correct answers. Because it seems to me quite different from, like, for example, a paper survey in which if you don't put your name on it and it gets shuffled within a stack of papers, it's really a lot of anonymity and you don't really have to worry it will be traced back to you. But I would just love your thoughts on how you've taken that into account and what that means in terms of thinking about the survey results.
That's a really fantastic question. And really, this is a sort of an endemic problem for survey research that's conducted in authoritarian regimes. And is one of the reasons that, so for example, when academics engage in this type of survey work and survey experiments, they'll often try to include certain what are sometimes called manipulation checks to, for example, identify whether people are responding truthfully, which is actually something we weren't able to do for this wave of the survey, but is something we're considering for future waves of the survey. So I think you're generally right, which is that we can say that it's anonymous, but they don't really know, which means that people may actually sort of self-select out of taking the survey if they feel they have a position that doesn't actually reflect what the government's is. And this is a problem you can't really ever overcome, because let's say if you were to try to administer a paper survey, maybe the second people see the questions and see that there's some divergence or their opinion diverges from that of the government, and they feel that that might be an issue for their personal security, then they'll stop taking the survey. So this is really it's an endemic challenge, which means that, like any survey really, and particularly surveys that are conducted in non-democratic countries, you need to take it's a good idea to take the results with still a grain of salt, because I can say for certainty that bias is present in the data, but it's not something that really we can, or really any researchers or social scientists can easily overcome. I'll quickly just refer to the work of one professor. The professor actually consulted us on this project, Haifeng Huang, at University of California, Merced, and these are the questions precisely that he also looks at to see, okay, how are people changing their opinions based off not only the way maybe the survey is administered, but the what it touches on and how sensitive those topics are. So I think this is a fantastic question, and I actually, this is a good point for me to, I guess, just explain to those just unfamiliar with survey research methods, is that no matter which method you adopt, they always have problems, they always have biases, and you can do your best to correct for those, but they'll never really truly reflect what you're trying to measure because of those problems, and they entail an important trade-off. I would welcome, I'm not sure if one's been done, I try to keep up to date with what this literature has to say, but I would be interested to see if someone has studied or will study whether people trust paper survey or trust anonymity related to paper surveys more, because I think that would be helpful information to know, but at the moment I'm not sure. But thank you for raising that. It's a really good question.
It won't surprise either of you to know that I have many questions here wanting to know the implications of this work on the issue of Taiwan. I know that was outside of the bounds of the questions you asked, but Yawei, if you wouldn't mind putting your holistic analyst hat on, when you saw the results, did you or do you see any broader implications for how the Chinese public might feel about indirect issues like a possible move by Beijing on Taiwan, or do you think this is purely specific to the issue of Ukraine?
I think the survey probably has offered no indication of how the public thinks about the Taiwan issue. But I think in observing the discussion in many social media chat rooms, as well as online seminars, again, in terms of the perception, I see many in China, among the international relations scholars who, or US-China relationship watchers, they seem to believe, again, this is related in a way to the biolab conspiracy, is that US, in order to effectively contain Russia, so push Russia into war in Ukraine. So the next stop is to push China into war with Taiwan. So that's the best way to contain the rise of China, or to make China disintegrate. More and more from the China side are discussing this. So they are obviously offering recommendations. They're saying, we need to remain calm. We're not in a position to cross the strait yet. And I think to the decision makers, it's a very, it's a wake up call. Is that, if Russia is encountering this kind of difficulties in fighting in Ukraine, then if China is going to cross the strait, that's a much more challenging undertaking. And Bonnie talked about this, I think, in the Truth of the Matter blog podcast. So I think this, again, ironically, is going to make China leadership think twice, three times, more times before they're going to make that fateful decision.
There's an interesting question that has come in about the response on China's best course of action, with 58% saying that it was to negotiate an end to the conflict. The question is whether we might be seeing the emergence of a possible expectations gap between what many Chinese citizens think Beijing will or is capable of doing and what Beijing wants to or is capable of doing. So I think the substance of the question is, might China be essentially creating a monster by inculcating and developing a view amongst Chinese citizens of the capability and competence of the Chinese state and the Communist Party to solve challenges? Now there is, again, I don't want to over-egg what we're reading in your survey, but the overwhelming majority saying, here's what we think China should do and negotiate an end to the conflict. When China either shows that it's unwilling to or unable to do that, does that create a bit of a cost for Beijing? And might we see this as a broader phenomenon with China sort of feeding the idea that it can do so much, but actually having real hard limitations or showing extreme unwillingness to actually take up the mantle of leadership in many ways? Is there a possible friction with the public that we may see emerging? A question for either of you.
If I could jump in on that just quickly first, this is a sort of unsatisfactory answer, but it would have been a benefit of a longer survey. So hopefully at some point one will be done, which is that it really depends on sort of what the underlying prism we're looking at that response is. Because on one hand, if people are looking at this conflict, and we have fairly good evidence to suggest that's the case, that they're looking at through the prism of sort of kind of anti-American, anti-Western sentiment, mediating the conflict might be a way to say, oh, look, China's foreign policy, China has, strong foreign policy. It should be able to do this, and it will make China look good in the eyes of the rest of the world. But at the same time, even amongst that set of respondents, people still think it's in China's best interest to support Russia in the conflict with Ukraine. So it suggests that those two things can those two responses can coexist side by side, and that really there isn't too much of a gap. I think based off at least the way that these questions are worded, there's nothing to, I suppose, indicate that people are sort of strongly wedded to the idea that China should mediate an end to the conflict based off of maybe humanitarian concerns about what's happening in Ukraine, as opposed to they think it would be beneficial to China's image. And I think, one thing, and this was actually pointed out to us, in our conversations with other experts, which is really, it's difficult to even get a sense of those responses side by side without, even more questions, sort of evaluating what people interpret those responses to actually mean. And that's something, it's hard to address in a short survey, and we had only, so much money to field this version of the survey. But in future, we will be fielding larger ones that can help address this question. But I think, and I understand this is a somewhat unsatisfactory answer, which is that we can't, read too much, I think, into sort of a gap in expectations based off those two questions alone.
So quickly, I think if the leadership decides, they're going to play a more proactive role in mediating or bringing the war to an end, they can cite this survey saying, there is popular support for this. Secondly, I think Beijing is in the position to do more, in terms of resources, in terms of its economic and other relationship arrangement with Russia. Beijing certainly can put more pressure. But again, I also think this is a good opportunity for US and China to work together to coordinate their policy, because it's very rare for them to find common ground. And now finally there is common ground. And, just to take Ambassador Qin Gang's article at face value saying you offer to work with us on this, let's have a serious discussion. Before, yes, we had discussion. You didn't believe in the intelligence offered, but now, we both realize, this war has to stop because it's just brutal. It's in nobody's interest. And for the two government officials, to look into this and to see if they can find common ground, not, as the Ned Price of the State Department spokesperson yesterday continued to say, the foreign ministry spokesperson saying, China side is still using Russia propaganda, to defend Russian positions, but also to take ambassador's word at face value and to start a conversation. I think that will be more meaningful than just accusing China of not condemning Russian invasion.
Just a final few questions, and Michael, Yawei, then we'll let you get about your day. But one is on what you suspect may shape these. If you were to do another survey in a few months, what may lead to a different or drastically different result? One of the questions is asking, do you expect this top line number of support to change if there is a significant turn for the worse in Russia's position in the war, or if Moscow escalates to use weapons of mass destruction? Any expectation for how that may shape affect the sort of top line number of support that respondents were giving? I know that's speculative, but we work at think tanks.
I think what is going to happen in Ukraine, how Russia is going to perform militarily, and if Russia does risk using weapons of mass destruction, I think the support number in China, my guess is going to decline tremendously. That's my quick response to that.
If I may add on to that. If I may add on to that point, I wonder whether it's fairly static just based off the way that information is filtering in about the conflict. I mean, considering the number of people that believe in the bioweapons conspiracy theory, if state media or social media decided that the usage of weapons of mass destruction was also, coordinated by the United States, or that, let's say, I mean, right now, the likelihood that Russia uses a tactical nuclear weapon doesn't seem highly likely, but there are very legitimate concerns about the usage of chemical or biological weapons. And considering the number of people who think that there are biolabs in Ukraine, I imagine the position of state media would be to say that, Russian usage of those weapons were actually the result of leaks from these biolabs. And then if that's the case, then it's probably not likely that public opinion would change dramatically. And to just provide one further example of this happening now, Cerny is a professor, I believe he's at Fudan University. After the Bucha massacre, he was putting out a large number of comments on the internet saying that, this was coordinated by the United States and by NATO, and that these were crisis actors and so on. And while this happened, after our survey, occurred before that massacre actually happened, I mean, it would be very interesting to sort of resurvey Chinese public opinion. But considering the general narrative that we've seen and how persuasive the pro-Russian media environment is now, I think it's likely that these positions are fairly static, at least for the short to medium term. But that's just my thought.
Final question is on what implications the results might have on the broader question of popular support for Beijing or competency or belief in the state capacity and competency. That there's a few questions around this, but I think what they're trying to tease out given that there is a clear sort of overwhelming pro-Russia bent, which it appears in many ways is the result of a consumption of state media, does that indicate that there's high levels of implicit or explicit support or trust in state institutions in China, including state media? Any thoughts on that narrower question? But what I take to be really interesting about this is there a broader proxy here in this one set of questions around Russia for just broader support for Beijing? I could imagine a dynamic here in the United States where everyone just believes, if we don't like Joe Biden, we believe the exact opposite of whatever the administration says. If we have high levels of trust in the administration, then we're more likely to accept narratives coming out of the White House. Could we read something like that into the poll results here? Again, final caveat. I know that's not in the survey results, but just ask you to put your speculative analytical hats on.
My quick response to that question is, whenever you talk to the China sort of elite, talking about the divergence of the elite opinion and the popular opinion, when you mention, there are problems at the leadership level, you often hear, well, the leadership is very popular among the ordinary Chinese citizens. So this may be a reflection, of how the leadership is perceived by the people at the grassroots level. I think that's my takeaway to that question. Michael,
final benediction to you before we wrap up.
I think I'm largely in agreement on this point. I don't think I have all that much productive to add. I think I just want to say thank you very much for letting us, introduce these survey results here, and we really look forward to sharing kind of future waves of survey data with you all in future.
if I may just add another, I think we also have to see the survey result in the greater context of U.S.-China rivalry. If U.S.-China relationship is better, then I think the survey result probably will be very different. I want to echo Michael in terms of thanking Jude, Bonny, and CSIS for providing us with this platform to share the findings. And like you guys, we try to find the pulse of the Chinese public, and your translation project is another great one that we also have benefited a lot. So we hope that we'll be able to work together down the road on some of the issues that we all care.
Likewise. Well, let me thank, let's continue the love fest here by thanking you, Yawei and Michael, for this really fantastic and important product, which again, everyone who's tuning in today can go to uscnpm.org or just Google US-China Perception Monitor, and you'll be able to now download this full piece. If you haven't gone back and read the Yawei piece, which I'm surprised anyone tuning into this most definitely has, but if you haven't, go there. But also they're continuing to put out just a raft of really important material, translations, essays on the website. So thank you for continuing to put out this great product, which helps us understand this highly evolving, very uncertain situation. Thank you to Comrade Bonny Lin for co-hosting this event today, and want to thank the entire CSIS team, Dinesh, Stefan, Eric, Lauren, Hannah, everyone who makes these events possible. Obviously, it goes without saying that we wouldn't get very far in an online event were it not for them. So thank everyone, and thanks everyone for tuning in. This broadcast will be available almost immediately on YouTube for rewatch. So if you missed anything any of us said, you can find this on YouTube and to share and to send around to colleagues and friends. So thank you everyone. Have a wonderful day, and see you at an upcoming CSIS or Cotter Center event.